The Adam Lowry news technically isn't the worst news the Jets could have received, but it's just about as bad as it gets. Hip surgery and a lengthy recovery over the summer means the need for a 2C now grows this coming summer.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is about how hockey is officially a psyop, and we are all just along for the ride, as it is once again going to be most likely Panthers-Oilers in the Stanley Cup Finals. I'm mostly kidding. If you saw the end of the Canes and Panthers series, you probably know what I'm talking about. But no, we're going to pretend that all of that doesn't exist, because the most important news you need to hear is that Adam Lowry is having hip surgery. And for the Winnipeg Jets, that now makes a second-line center not only one of the biggest needs this coming offseason, but priority number one, period. Winnipeg cannot survive without adding another center next season. And with Adam Lowry likely going to have some pretty significant recovery, this is going to be a very big situation to watch for the Jets. I don't think a lot of other folks out there who are going to talk about this from, media sources that are maybe not in tune with how the Jets are built and how this team is, are going to realize how big of a loss this could be. And it's not that Lowry is going to miss games all that often at the start of the season, but look, he may not be right and may not be Adam Lowry for a good year or so. When you have hip surgery, it is pretty significant. So I want to talk a little bit about the ramifications of that, and also talk about some interesting stuff that came out of a CJOB, I don't want to say it was a hit piece, but I don't think it was particularly flattering about Nikolai Ehlers and the silence around his contract extension talks. This could be one of the craziest summers in Winnipeg Jets recent history, so buckle up, because it's going to start with the Jets needing to find a huge second-line center. Now, this was always a problem for Winnipeg. It's not like it's a new thing, but I think the priority order has now shifted. It was always my first priority to begin with. Another center who's a top six guy would immediately be, for the Jets, probably their most important piece to add. But with Lowry likely sidelined for at least the start of the season, and perhaps not going to be 100% going in through most of the year, the Jets are in real trouble now. They don't have internal replacements for a guy like Adam. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, he's the third line center. Why is this such a big deal? And if you actually look at the deployments and how this team plays, we all know that Lowry is our shadow 2C. The team may call him part of the best third line in the NHL. Everyone else may say it. We know the truth. He eats a ton of minutes for this team. He is super critical. And more importantly, Lowry, whether, accurately or not, has often been used as Winnipeg's de facto matchup shutdown guy. He's supposed to soften up the competition for everyone else. Where I think Lowry tends to really excel is taking out other depth lines, right? He neutralizes opposing bottom sixes and eats some very hard matchups against tougher lines when the Jets have last change. But with him likely going through a lengthy rehab process where he may not come out of it at 100%, especially with him being in his early 30s and, it being hip surgery, this has a really iffy future projection, right? A lot of folks who go through hip surgery, some of them can come out okay, but it's not often that you come out 100%. And for a player at his age, there's just no guarantee. And my guess is, once Lowry comes out of this, his style is very physical. It's very demanding. I don't think that he's going to be the same player, even if rehab goes well. It's just not that likely. And so the Jets really have to treat this like priority number one is now finding another center. It was going to be very difficult, even with him at full strength, finding somebody to replace Nemesnikov, because like you can't go into next year with Vlad between Perfetti and whoever is going to replace Ehlers. And yes, I did just say replace Ehlers. That's even more fun and another situation for the Jets to contend with. But first, finding that second line center had to be a priority. And now, if Lowry is not 100%, it becomes a real red alarm situation. In my mind, this could be a big enough deal to where it impacts how the Jets season unfolds. Lowry is critical to this team's success. How they have built so many of their matchups in key battles is really flowing through his stick and skates. And I know, again, it sounds a little crazy to say that about a guy who you might look at his ice time and not really think it's as important to a team as it is. But for the Jets, Lowry is one of our offensive linchpins. His two-way dominance in play has been something that the Jets coaching staff has relied upon countless times. And if he's not 100%, you suddenly lose that ability. We saw him in the postseason when it was very clear that Lowry was not healthy. He was, quite frankly, a shadow of himself for a lot of the postseason. He couldn't hit as hard. He struggled in the back check and chase, and he just didn't have that same dominating presence that we're used to. Towards the end of the Stars series, we saw more of his classic Lowry play, but playing through really bad hips that need surgery is, first off, insane. I can't believe that he did that and was able to play at the level that he was. And secondly, going forward, if that surgery, does fix whatever's ailing him, great. But I think you look at how that rehab tends to go for a lot of guys his age, and I think the writing for the longer term is on the wall. The Jets aren't going to be able to ask him to do all the stuff that they usually do. He's going to have a reduction in responsibility in minutes. And the Jets, frankly, need a more offensively minded second line center. They need somebody who can really elevate this team and add some real flair. Lowry has done an incredible job handling that role in a way that I don't know that many other teams ask of their third line centers, much less a team that looks at the middle six in the way that most contenders do. Lowry has had to be something of a jack of all trades for this team, and I think that they got very far with it. But now it's time to reevaluate how they approach this, and not just because Lowry's health could potentially be somewhat in question, but ultimately, Winnipeg needs more offense, period, right? We saw it throughout the postseason that there were times where they really had trouble scoring. And I love Lowry, but that's not his strong suit. And so for the Jets, this is a really critical period. And, you think about how many departures they're likely to have, how they have a real opportunity to overhaul this team's core and sort of rebuild, or not necessarily rebuild in the usual sense, but maybe retooling on the fly, right? This is going to be a very tricky summer, and it's going to be even harder because the writing is on the wall with Nikolai Ehlers. We call him Fly for a reason, but he's probably going to be flying for greener pastures this coming summer. If that CJOB piece is anything to go by, it seems like the team is signaling that they know he's gone too. We'll chat about the implications about all of this and what to do in the life without Ehlers in just a brief moment. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving contains 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. And they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Now, as a Marylander, I'm used to cracking open crabs, so I like the shelled variety, but maybe you don't have the same convenience and time. You want something that's easier. You want something that's fast, whether you're dropping kids off at school, you need to pick me up before the gym, or you just want something to fight that 3 p.m. slump. Well, they've got a no-shelled variety that comes in great flavors. And of course, Wonderful Pistachios is a complete protein providing all 9 essential amino acids. So get snacking and get cracking with a snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I just spoke about how it was going to be very difficult with the Adam Lowry news, and there is even a bigger tidbit here following the Lowry stuff that might have a really outsized impact on Winnipeg's upcoming season. Nick Ehlers is probably gone, and I think we all knew that this was a likely outcome. I've talked about it at length, and I want to talk a little bit about the CJOB piece that was put out there first from Edmonds. For one thing, I really dislike the framing of this article because I feel like in many ways it puts the onus on Ehlers, and that's not fair to me. It makes the Jets seem like they're doing all they can to retain him, and that might very well be true now. But the reason that Winnipeg is in this position is because for years, Ehlers was underutilized. Unlike Scheifele and Hellebuck, Ehlers has always been given second billing. When somebody got demoted, guess who it was often out of the top six? Ehlers. You look at the playoff time on ice distributions, even for this past postseason, and look who's ahead of Nick on the 5v5 deployments. Lowry, Niederreiter, Appleton. And look, I get it, right? Lowry's line's very critical. The Jets know this. But even if they might be playing similar numbers of shifts, it just cannot happen that, you have Ehlers behind a Mason Appleton in time on ice, especially when you are trailing in the series. And one of your issues is that you have struggled to figure out a way to score against Jake Ottinger. Otter was great during the series, but I think Winnipeg also needed to put him under some real pressure in ways that maybe they weren't doing enough of with some of the other depth units. And so for Winnipeg, I just, I hate that this idea is making it look like Ehlers is the one at fault. Honestly, Winnipeg's whole situation and handling of how this has all come about, it's on the team. They've made their choice years ago, and I don't think that they tried to rectify it in time. And because of that, Ehlers has had his wage ability and salary raises depressed because of it. He doesn't have the bargaining power that other players would. If he had been played as the top six or even top line player that he really is, he'd probably have more points. He might be pushing 70, 80, maybe even higher points totals than that. And, I don't say that to be, disparaging. I think this is just the reality. And so, the idea that Nick has to be the one to bear the weight of this is, for me, not fair. I don't think that that really is a fair reflection of the situation. I think it's really on the Jets to sort of understand that they made this bed themselves, and they have to now solve for how to, get out of it, right? And I think the Jets do have options. I don't think that this is a scenario where when Ehlers leaves, they are completely screwed. I think it's going to be very hard for them to find a player with that level of impact, and make no mistake, right? We're going to see it pretty quick. You look at this year's power play, and immediately that's going to be one of the first areas where I think his presence is going to be missed, right? That power play that Payne constructed relied on having a rover like Ehlers who could swap to almost any position on the ice in that five-man rotation, and it made the unit unpredictable and so much more dangerous. They're going to have to find somebody else to do that. And look, maybe you get Brad Lambert into the team. Maybe he does well. That's awesome. But it's not the thing that I would bank on. And this team is trying to compete and win the Stanley Cup right now. They know that their contention window is for as long as Hellebuck is able to stay at the top of his game. And so this is a really hard situation. But I think Winnipeg needs to be honest with itself. And I'm sure internally they do know this. I think the team has tried to sort of go past this and fix it, right? I think that, they probably would love to go back and redo some things. I think that they have learned a lot of lessons. But to see somebody who's really closely connected to the team say something like this also makes me wonder if they know where the culpability lies. And maybe it's all part of this whole, PR scheme, right? You need to spin the situation a certain way. But, I've always felt that Ehlers was professional. Whenever he came under fire, he was always one of the first people to point the finger at himself. And, him being silent about his contract or whatever didn't really bother me. It's his prerogative. A lot of agents probably advise their players to be relatively non-committal and maybe even a little guarded because, again, it's all part of the bargaining process and the leverage process. And with Ehlers in particular, his situation's a little more sensitive. He didn't get top billing like Scheifele and Hellebuck did before they had their contract extensions. And those guys pretty publicly made it seem like they were okay with walking. So with Ehlers, I just don't understand why we're going this route. I don't think it's necessary. And without him, this team is going to have some real issues. The lack of scoring and offense is probably going to be a bigger problem. You factor in losing Lowry and getting him back with maybe, 70% effectiveness. Suddenly you have even more holes to contend with. And Nick going is a big part of your transition game walking. It's a big part of your power play leaving. Your 5v5 offense is going to have to find more creativity somewhere else. And this is where I think this has to be the summer of Chevy. I said it a couple of episodes ago. I've really started to hammer in on this process. This is the offseason that the front office has to nail. They've had other years where they've had their backs against the wall, but usually that's when they've had a player who wants out. This is one of the first times where the Jets are really dealing with multiple franchise-altering decisions in one moment. You've got Kyle Connor expiring very soon. His contract's going to be up in the near future, and, I don't know if the Jets are in the best position to bring him back. I really don't know how that's going to look. Ehlers going is going to be one of their first big dominoes to leave, and so this team is in a pretty precarious spot, and I want to have a lot of confidence. But I think I'm struggling right now because the Jets traditionally aren't doing the kinds of things that teams in this spot would have to do to get out of this. Winnipeg has not really been a super proactive trade team. When they are, they usually go for modest players, right? They're not acquiring superstars. They're not taking big swings. They might be in on some of these guys, but they're not really the ones who end up with those big names. This is the first time where that's going to have to change. The Jets need to be the team that's beating others to the punch. They're probably going to have to spend some real assets. I don't think they can avoid it anymore. This is a scenario where I think I was dreading it a little bit, and why I was probably really upset by the trade deadline this year was because I kind of felt like this summer could be a real turning point for this team. And I didn't know if it was going to be for the better. There are two ways that you can look at this, right? Optimistically, maybe this is where you start to lean on your youth and you change your team's overall philosophy. Pessimistically, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but the Jets are flirting with some real, I would say, razor-thin margins here that either keep them in a good playoff spot or start to push them more towards the wild card. And I think these potential losses are already pushing the Jets more towards a wild card or even a narrow playoff miss. Hellebuck and certain players on this team are going to keep the team's floor high enough to where I don't think that they're going to miss necessarily, but they are getting closer and closer to those edges and margins as constructed. So this is where the summer is going to be really critical. The team really hasn't been in a particular position like this, not with, a big piece of your team that you drafted and developed departing on, as they would say in footy, on a free. And so this is a big moment for the team, and how they respond is going to say a lot about the lessons that they have or have not learned from the last several years. And I'm hoping that they come out with the right understanding and the right approach. And if they try for something and they come very close, but they can't quite close the deal, I would 100% understand, even if I'd still be bothered by it. But I think the team really needs to communicate and really needs to show that it's understanding where this team has some real gaps and weaknesses, because the fan base just kind of needs to see it. This was a really crushing playoff loss. I think emotionally, this was one of the hardest ones for me to swallow. And with all these departures and a lot of change coming, not only for the Jets, but really the rest of the NHL, this is probably one of the biggest off seasons we've ever seen, and Winnipeg has to try and knock this one out of the park. But let's be real, right? You got 3 strikes, and Winnipeg is probably down 2 of them. So this last one has to be your grand slam. I want to talk a little bit in just a moment about whether this team as is can make the playoffs and what are some of the real risks that they run if they keep things and run it back for the most part as they did this year. Hey, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us as we are chatting a little bit about the Jets kind of playing with some really tight margins right now. This has always been Winnipeg's approach, right? This team is a squad that wins by committee. They have done things in ways that are in quite remarkable fashion, a little bit of a unicorn among a lot of other NHL teams. You don't see many squads built the way that the Jets are, winning President's trophies, winning their divisions, and getting as far in the postseason as the Jets did this year. But I think we can also be honest and say that, the Jets were 1.6 seconds away in the first round from that not really being a reality. They had some moments during the regular season where, big injuries very nearly put them in some tough spots. But because they came out of the gates with such a strong start to the year and racked up so many early wins, they gave themselves a fantastic cushion to get one of their first ever banners. And so this past year was awesome. And I think it also illustrates that in many ways, you have to have tons of good fortune. Everything really has to go your way almost to the full extent. And you have to have as healthy of a team as you can to get within touching distance of some of those top awards. When things started to pile up during the playoffs and the Jets really didn't have a response for it, you kind of saw where Winnipeg really started to falter. The power play wasn't reliable. The 5v5 scoring was very inconsistent. The goaltending was for once questionable. This was a situation where Hellebuyck probably wasn't at 100%, especially in that first round. And so, it was really imperative for the Jets to try and give themselves insurance for all issues, right? I always feel like in hockey, you have to plan for the worst, but hope for the best. If you give yourself as many chances to succeed as you can, then we can't complain about it, right? I don't know that the Jets were able to do that. And of course, the report about Nelson today coming out that he rejected the Jets, that's all fine and good. But there were other players the Jets could have been in on and could have been pursuing. And maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I think that they kind of, again, put themselves in the basket of Nelson and it was Nelson or bust, which is understandable. He was the top trade asset. But I think, sometimes the Jets get really narrow focuses. And I worry that when they do this, it's a pattern of behavior over the years where they think that they can kind of keep running it back and making small tweaks here and there. And I think the ability for the Jets to keep doing that is finally gone. You're going to have some big departures. You're going to have almost no one internally who can likely replace that off the bat. If you're expecting 3 or 4 rookies to take the place of Lowry, of Ehlers, guys like that, I don't know, man. Appleton, you can replace internally with a Shibrikov. Nikita's going to bring a very different dimension to your team, a much needed one for your third line. But now you don't have that second/third line center who was supposed to be his anchor. And so you're going to have Nemestikov likely playing elevated minutes. You're going to have Barron playing elevated minutes. And I just think Winnipeg is really flirting with a dangerous situation here if they don't get a center. Now, what I'm hoping for, and sort of what the optimist and hopeful person in me is feeling, is that the Jets know this, that, the players have pushed for them to make some changes this offseason. Maybe they even think about spreading the talent and wealth out a little bit. Maybe they split Scheifele and Connor for the first time ever. I think about some of that stuff, but I also know that, humans are creatures of habit and pattern. And we've seen a lot of patterns with this team that make me skeptical. I want to believe in this squad and their ability to adapt to what did and didn't work this year, but I really need to see that reflected. This past year, a lot of players had career seasons, and relying on that again for a second straight season just doesn't really feel like a sustainable way to do it. Do I think a lot of the guys are going to come back and play really well? Absolutely. I don't question that at all. But this team is getting older. They're not getting younger. The core is starting to age out a bit. And, you're looking at Lambert, Shubakov, Reshevsky, Jaeger, maybe, Salamanson, some really exciting players who are likely to fill into maybe your middle six, maybe your eventual third pairing at the start. You have some roster spots available, but you're not expecting them to come in and light the league on fire immediately. That's just not the environment that I think these guys are going to come into. It's not what I think they're going to do. Maybe Shubakov can hit the ground running, and maybe Lambert will start to really find his feet. But it's just a lot to bank on. And so the Jets need to, again, give themselves some kind of insurance. The options out there, I don't know if they're going to be amazing. Every single trade that you can make is going to have some kind of a drawback, right? It's always a give and take, and that's just not going to change. But I think the Jets really stand to lose a lot more if they don't than if they do. This is the offseason where, again, summer of Chevy has to be this time. If you go after a Pettersson, obviously Elias has some real questions around his game and what his health is. But if you take a swing like that, I would 100% not only respect it, but I would endorse that kind of thinking. The Jets have to be aggressive here. This is one of those off seasons where they're going to have to figure out if they're really serious and how committed they are to winning this cup. I think everyone in that room wants it so badly. Seeing Scheifele's reaction to his own penalty broke my heart, and I want to see them get rewarded for working really hard, for doing great things this past season. And now it's really in the front office's ball court to solve this. They have some huge decisions to make, some very big questions, and they are the only ones who can answer all of this. Now, do I think they will? I think they're going to try. I don't know what it's going to lead to. I'm very curious to see what happens come draft time. That's going to be a very big tell as to where Winnipeg's mindset is. If they just stay the course, that would not be the right decision. I think the Jets need to change their thinking. They need to approach this offseason and come out swinging, right? Even if it takes time, just be aggressive. Go out there looking for options and make something happen, right? Even if you have to overpay a bit, make something happen. This team is not promised tomorrow. None of us are. And so it's really important that you make the most of the moment that you have. We saw what happened after 2017, 2018, when all we heard was how the Winnipeg Jets were going to be a dynasty and it was a one-run team. This team, I think, can learn from those mistakes and correct course to put itself in a much better path. So curious to know how you feel about all this. Do you agree with these sentiments? Do you believe that the Jets are going to right the ship and get on a better course? Drop your thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, so see you then. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.